Okay, now it was mentioned briefly this, well, Murak mentioned this when she was talking about the idea that you can have multiple regional partners. And when you start to talk about Brazilian leadership and contestation for Brazilian leadership in South America, Argentina is always the one that comes to mind. But possibly the more interesting one is Colombia, when you talk about countries with real substantive security issues, both in traditional and non-traditional senses, with major impacts on large parts of Brazil. Colombia is very important, yet, as I think I was talking to Arlene Tickner and with you, Sandra, there's almost nothing talking about Brazil-Colombia relations and what the rise of Brazil means. So we're very lucky today that Sandra Borda has joined us today and is going to present a paper on Colombia's reaction to the rise of Brazil. Okay.
Thank you. First of all, I want to apologize for this voice. This is the problem of a long trip in being locked in an airplane with a lot of people. So please be patient with the noise that you're going to hear through this presentation. I want to start just by showing this graph and to confirm the point that Sean just made about the nature of the relationship between Colombia and Brazil. Probably during the beginning of the 2000s and before that, we don't have a strong relationship with Brazil. That's basically the main point that I want to start with. If you see the arrows here, what you're going to see is that our relationship, at least in commercial terms, starts during the first part of the Uribe administration and not before that. This is not only about commerce, it's also about many different issues. We don't have experts on Brazil in Colombia. We don't have a lot of people who speak Portuguese. If you review the literature about Colombian foreign policy and bilateral relationships, you're not going to find a lot of material about Colombia and Brazil. Actually, maybe the first articles and the first books start to appear probably in 2002 and 2003. So we're very much strangers at this point of the story. We don't have a strong relationship. It's getting different with the last part of the Uribe administration, as I'm going to show in a minute, and it's getting very different now that the Santos administration is in power. But before that, I just want to emphasize the point that we haven't had a close relationship with Brazil. The sort of interest that we can talk about since the 2002 year until right now, and this is again Uribe administration, goes through two different topics. One of them is related to commerce, business, foreign direct investment, and the other one is related to the border security. We're talking about illegal drugs in the Amazon. We're talking about cooperation in terms of traffic of weapons and explosives. But we're not talking about different issues here. Those are probably the main topics that the two countries start to talk about. And before I go ahead and explain what happens during the Uribe and the Santos administration in terms of a bilateral relationship, I just want to explain a little bit why it has taken so long for both countries to start talking, even though they share a border and they share a lot of interests. And one of the issues that I want to emphasize is precisely the fact that one of the key explanatory factors, if you want to call it that way, it has to do with the nature of Colombia's foreign policy. And of course, Colombian foreign policy is related directly to the sort of problematic that we deal with internally. Three main features of Colombia's foreign policy explain why we have been so distant. One of them, and it's distant from Brazil and from the whole region. This is something important to clarify. One of them has to do with what we call in Colombia our special relationship with the United States. Since the very beginning of our national history, during the Panama Canal negotiation, we've had the idea that we have to develop our foreign policy always looking at the United States as our main ally. And of course, this is something, as I'm going to explain later, that has helped us deal with our war against drugs, with our war against the insurgent organization in Colombia. So I just want to state right now that this is one of the things that differentiates Colombia from the rest of the countries in the region, and I'm going to show the numbers in a minute, is precisely the closeness of this relationship. The other element is precisely that our foreign policy has been an instrument to satisfy very specific domestic necessities, not even interest, necessities. One of them has been the war against illegal drugs, and the other one has been the war against the insurgent organizations in Colombia. So basically these two points are very closely related to each other, because we think about our foreign policy as a way to obtain material, military, and political support to fight these two wars. And finally, of course, and as a sort of implication of the previous features, the emphasis of our foreign policy is on military and security components. And this is the reason why you're not going to hear me talking a lot about political economy and about the sort of commercial links that we have with the rest of the regions, because for Colombia, the issue has always been about security, and the commercial links have been a sort of a second best option for our foreign policy. So where do these features come from, and why are they are the main components of our foreign policy? To begin with, I just want to give you a little bit of context, because right now, probably in the hemispheric debate, but also around the world, you hear a lot about this Colombian success story, right? I mean, we overcame a lot of security problems. We were in the middle of a peace negotiation right now, which is mainly due to an important change in the balance of power between the state and the guerrillas. You have more tourists in Colombia right now. People feel like it's safe to go to Colombia now. That was not what was happening during the 90s. And probably this is one of the most difficult decades for the country. And at this point, not only the Colombian elites, but even in Washington, people were talking about the possibility of the guerrillas taking the power and taking the state, the Colombian state. We were in the middle of a very difficult balance of power with the guerrillas. Some people say that at some point the guerrillas had the control of at least half of the country, the territory in the country. So it was a pretty difficult time. As a Colombian, people couldn't move around the country. So it was not the same thing that we see today when we talk about Colombia. And this basically put the state in a position of having to do something about it. It was a moment in which the state needed to basically alter dramatically the balance of power with the guerrilla. And here I just want to say something, and this is part of the reason why we're distant vis-a-vis Brazil, but also to some other countries in the region. This was a moment at the end of the 90s when the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s, when the last peace process failed, Colombia was looking for allies around the international community, right? We were looking for political support, we were looking for military support too, because peace and dialogues were not an option anymore. And sadly enough, we didn't find that in the region. And this is a constant complaint of Colombian governments, not only the Uribe administration and the previous Pastrana administration, but what you feel is not only that there was not support, but also that there was not a regional understanding about what was going on in Colombia. Like the countries and the governments in the region didn't understand what was the nature of the Colombian conflict, and they preferred just to keep distance until, as I'm going to show in a minute, they couldn't keep distance because the conflict was internationalizing, and that was an inevitable sort of outcome. This part of the process creates two different effects in the region. One of them is that the countries start to create this sort of distrust toward the country because they don't understand what was going on, but at the same time you start to see the first movements of guerrilla organization toward the borders, and it was not very clear how to deal with that process at this juncture. And And then there was no cooperation with Colombia at that point. Colombia asked, that was the very beginning of the attempt to convince Venezuela that they had to pay attention to what was going on with guerrilla organizations in the border, and that didn't work. It was also the same at the same time that we asked Ecuador to check what was going on in the border, and that didn't work out either. So it was a pretty tough juncture in terms of finding regional cooperation. And this, basically, we have a border with Brazil. This was not an issue with Brazil. You know that the Amazon is right there, so this was not a strategic place for the guerrilla to move around. But the Venezuela and the Ecuadorian, oh Jesus, seriously? Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead. So in this sort of regional scenario that I'm trying to describe here, the one and only country that shows up in order to give military support and political support was the US. The traditional ally, we got money from the US, we got a lot of military support. We got this plan Colombia, which was probably the most important anti-insurgency plan that the United States had around the world at that point. And this created, I'm going to show you the numbers in a minute, this created a very serious regional problem because it helped the Colombian state to sort of change the balance of power vis-a-vis the guerrillas, but it also created a problem with Venezuela and with Brazil too. And it's a very obvious problem. This is your typical dilemma of security in international relations, right? You create a very professional armed forces, you have a lot of weapons, you are stronger militarily, and that immediately translates into a sort of threat for your neighbors, and that's not weird. I mean, that happens all the time in international relations. And the top of this strategy for Colombia was something that further separated the country from the rest of the region. The Uribe administration decided to join the Bush administration in the war against terror. And the strategy for the Colombian government in order to get more money from the US was basically to say that the fight against insurgency was part of the global fight against terrorism after September 11. So what I'm trying to say here is that while the rest of the region was kind of getting some distance in between with the United States and trying to move a little bit toward a different direction and creating additional autonomy spaces in terms of foreign policy, we were doing exactly the opposite. We were getting closer to the United States. So we were opening the sort of gap between us and the region. The unintended result was, of course, further distrust, right? What the whole region started to see in more radical versions, such as Venezuela, and more moderate versions, such as Brazil, was the fact that the United States, and this was the reading in the region during that time, around 2008 probably and before, was the fact that the US was using Colombia as a way to intervene in the region, right? And militarily, not politically. He was at some point, President Chavez talked about Colombia as the pawn of the United States in the region, right? So this created, I insist, a distance with the region, and this was something that was very vocal during that time by many governments in the area. So this is a point that I already made. I'm going to go through this very fast because I just want to talk a little bit about the change during the current administration. The one and only thing that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about Brazil and the Colombian conflict is that Brazil is probably the only neighbor, and this compared to Venezuela and compared to Ecuador, that doesn't seem to view the Colombian conflict as a threat to itself. Right? Venezuela and Ecuador see the internationalization of the Colombian conflict as a very serious threat. In fact, if you see Ecuadorian military expenditure during the last 5 years, it has grew in an amazing way due precisely to the difficulties of the relationship with Colombia. Brazil doesn't have that view, and this is a very interesting thing because for Brazil, the point here is just about security in the border and not that much about an existential threat posed by the Colombian conflict. And the final issue that I want to review here is just the fact that part of what you see in the region is a movement not only toward the left, but toward a different sort of approach to the relationship with the United States. The region feels that, you know, the US power is in decline, and this is a very good moment to start thinking, you know, in a very independent way, and that's perfectly legitimate. But Colombia doesn't seem to fit that project. And this is something that it creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance with the rest of the region. This is just the numbers, just to give you a little bit of evidence about the special relationship between Colombia and the United States. Just want you to notice that during the last couple of years, what you see is a decline in military assistance due to the fact that we're winning the war against drugs, and we're winning the war against the subversion, and also that the U.S. doesn't have more money. And then it's just getting coupled with the economic assistance. That's one of the main purpose of the U.S. at this point, just getting both types of assistance to meet at some point and generate that sort of equilibrium. I want to talk about the Santos Administration, because this Santos Administration has a very interesting approach to the relationship with Brazil and the relationship with the region. The very first thing that President Santos does for the first time in many years of diplomatic history in Colombia, 5 minutes to talk about the Santos Administration, okay, is to go to Brazil in an official trip before going to the United States. And this is a very important signal that Santos is sending to the region, right? This is the moment in which Santos says, well, I want to come back to the region after all the struggle and all the problems during the Uribe administration. He goes there and makes an additional signal, which is basically to propose Maria Emma Mejia as a Secretary General of UNASUR. Santos understands that UNASUR is mainly a Brazilian project, and that Brazilian diplomacy is very interested in just basically advancing this organization. So sending a Colombian to the post of Secretary General of this organization is a way to say that we're coming back to the region and we're there to help. Santos, and this is a very different approach to what Uribe does, doesn't seem to see this coming back to the region as something opposed to having a strong and special relationship with the U.S., right? Uribe used to say that was impossible, right? That if you have a strong relationship with the U.S., you're never gonna get along with Brazil or with Venezuela, because it was a zero-sum game. For Santos, it's different. Santos is convinced that you can be a little bit more pragmatic, and you can have. He just achieved a free trade agreement with the United States, and at the same time, he's being very active in the region, diplomatically speaking. This Pacific Alliance thing that we've been talking about since yesterday is a very interesting move, because it shows part of the pragmatism in Colombia's foreign policy that I'm talking about. And I would add to the discussion that we were having before during Maruk's presentation, that even though I think that there are very strong economic interests behind this project, I do think that there is a political interest involved here too. And it seems to me, and this is something that I gathered from a couple of discussions that I was in during the Santos campaign, that Colombia is very interested in having some sort of balance in terms of regional organizations when you talk about, you know, the political content or the ideological content of these organizations. In other words, Santos seems to think that the ALBA and Venezuela and the sort of sphere of influence of Venezuela is very organized in organizational and in institutional terms, and that this is something that governments that he judges are like center-right governments should do too. And the alliance of the Pacific has something to do with it, right? Has something to do with the idea of just, you know, paying attention to the fact that this region is moving to the left, but not everybody's moving to the left. That everybody's reviewing the relationship with the United States, but not in the same way. And it seems to me that this is sort of a political alternative move that we have to analyze also in that fashion. The border cooperation with Brazil has improved quite a lot since the Uribe administration, during the beginning of the Santos administration. Binational commissions are working better than ever. Actually, the people at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombia say that the country that has advanced more the sort of institutional security cooperation in the border between Venezuela, Ecuador, and Brazil is precisely Brazil. So we're working together in terms of this border cooperation, and it seems to be, giving results. But this is where the pragmatism comes. We're sharing a seat in the Security Council, Brazil and Colombia, for the first time in 2 minutes. For the first time in a long time. And we don't have shared positions. Colombia went to the Security Council with the idea that we were going to represent the region, and Brazil too. And we don't have the same positions. The debate around Libya and the no-fly zone was a very, very hard debate at the Security Council between Brazil and Colombia. Colombia aligned with the U.S. position, surprise, and Brazil didn't. In the Haiti debate, both countries have been having pretty much the same sort of position, less discussion there. But what I'm trying to say is that it's still very difficult, and this is something that I would agree with Maruk, it's very difficult to think about a South American position in international forum at this point. We're not there. We're not there, and we're not going to be there in a long time. And by the way, we should talk at some point about this Haiti thing, Sean. Haiti is a very interesting project led by Brazil, and there's also dissent and discussion about the role that South America is supposed to be playing there. Because if we're independent right now, if we have a different relationship with the U.S., Haiti is part of our zone. This is a problem that we were supposed to be dealing with, and we're not quite there yet. The other very interesting thing, Brazil hasn't shown up anywhere in this whole process, the peace process in Colombia. Right now, the only countries that are participating of the peace process, which is going to begin in the first week of October, are Venezuela, Chile, and Cuba. That's it. And this is a very interesting turn of events because President Lula was very insistent on the fact that Brazil had to be part of this. And that's not even one, right? Okay, I'm gonna finish in 2 seconds. So this creates a lot of questions. Because it seems to me that the peace process in Colombia was the greatest scenario for the Brazilian leadership, right? It's the last conflict in the hemisphere. If this is going to be the end of the last civil conflict in the hemisphere, Brazil was supposed to be there, right? And it hasn't appeared yet. And it seems, we were talking about this with Arlene before I came here, and Arlene's thesis is that you here have to look very carefully at the change in regional foreign policy, Brazilian foreign policy, from Lula's administration to Dilma's administration. Arlene feels, and this is not something that I would already subscribe yet, but it's an interesting idea, that what you see with Dilma is a little bit of a withdrawal from this regional leadership role, and that maybe since we're in the middle of this peace process that might work, and President Santos is constantly talking about regional leadership, maybe this is a space that is opening up not only for Colombia but for some other countries to step up and assume a different role in the region. But that's something that we need to wait a little bit more to see. And finally, this is a very similar question to one question that Maruk was posing. To what extent does Brazil need the region in order to play a global leadership role? If you look at the Security Council seat, of course, I mean, it would be great if they have the Latin American votes, right? But if not, is it really necessary? I mean, do we really need UNASUR and Brazil playing a great role in the region in order to step up as a sort of a power in the global system? I think that this is a question that we need to answer in order to sort out to what extent this is going to go further in the future, right? I'm going to leave there because, yeah, it's over. All right. There are suspicions. There are. And especially during the Uribe administration. I wouldn't say that much during the Santos administration. Santos is a little bit wiser in terms of foreign policy. But during the Uribe administration, I heard a lot of times people from the government being very, scared of like this sort of tie between Brazil and Venezuela. Many times during the debates about, the invasion in Angostura, in Ecuador, and our issues with Venezuela during the Uribe administration, many times President Uribe complained about the fact that Brazil was always siding with Chavez in these fights. So that created a lot of distrust among political elites. I think that they have overcome, because Lula did a great job trying to persuade people that that was not the case, and that Brazilian position was a lot more pragmatic than that it didn't make any sense for Brazil to side with Venezuela, among other things. But that idea existed in the minds of Colombian officers. You're absolutely right. That was the suspicion, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that we haven't signed up any peace process or anything, and this is going to take a long time. But I do think that just the prospect of the peace process is changing a lot, our vision of the international system and the role we're supposed to play. We look at our relationship with the U.S., for instance, in a totally different way right now. This is not the time when we were thinking about the U.S. and only about the U.S. as a sort of resources, among other things, because they are not giving us that much money anymore. And I think that President Santos has also a very pragmatic vision of his relationship with the rest of the region, because he understands that a sort of Cold War approach to our foreign policy is not going to help in the negotiation table. So he needs to switch a little bit things before going to a negotiation table, or what happened in the 1990s with the previous peace process is going to repeat itself, which is basically that the FARC was thinking that the government was constructing a sort of plan B with the US, and they weren't really interested in negotiating. So there are things happening already, and I think that those changes are only going to deepen after if this succeeds, after we finish with the conflict. And it has an additional dimension, and I think that President Santos is very clear about this, which is basically that a Colombia with no conflict, it has an immense potential in terms of foreign policy. And he wants to use foreign policy as a tool to create prosperity and to create economic wealth, and all these things are going to be way easier if you don't have to deal with a conflict. He's thinking about turning Colombia into a sort of leader, economic leader in the region, and he's thinking about himself too. I mean, he's thinking about being an international figure, the final president who achieved the peace in Colombia. So this is going to change a lot of things. I totally agree. And there's one slight thing that I would like to add. One of the things that is going to change is this idea that we have in Colombia, and this is public opinion all over the place. People think that it's only Uribe, but it's the public opinion in general. We thought during the 2008, the worst part of our relationship with the region, those meetings, the Grupo de Rio and the UNASUR televised, and Uribe fighting and yelling, and all these people answering, all this sort of theater. We developed this sort of mindset according to which the region was ganging up on us. The whole region was getting together in order to sabotage Colombia and the fight against guerrillas and all these things. We came to a point where we saw the region as an enemy. So I think that this is going to change substantially the sort of approach that we have to our neighbors, to the regional organizations, and to the area in general. Well, part of what Brazil and Colombia tried to do at the Security Council was to sort of link the security discussion in Haiti with the development discussion, right? I mean, the idea is a very straightforward idea, which is basically that you cannot face the Haitian problem with weapons and armed forces and all these things, that you also need to develop infrastructure, develop institutions, all these things. Unfortunately, this for the permanent members of the United Nations was a dead end, right? I mean, the permanent members don't want to hear any talk about development or institutions or anything like that. For them, the Security Council is for security. That's it. And they have a very straightforward and very close-minded, I would say, version of what it needs to be done, at least from the Security Council. The UNASUR had a lot of debates about Haiti. And again, the point here was that Haiti was part of the area, and that we needed to do something without the approval of the United States, that there was something to be done from South America. Sadly, though, that faced debates, strong debates in Argentina, for example, and Brazil at the very end was trying to withdraw a little bit because they just felt that a multinational force was not enough to solve this problem. But I guess that it's interesting just to follow and to keep track of the debate in the region, because it shows, this attempt, I insist, in just dealing with our own stuff. And maybe this UNASUR collected a lot of money from members that went to Haiti. This is something just to kind of follow, I would say. Mm-hmm. And this is something that has popped up a couple of times during the conference. This whole UNASUR project is a very weird animal, right? Because it's not a free trade thing anymore, because we just came to the conclusion that free trade stuff, that starting integration with free trade and all these things is way too complicated and it doesn't work. So somehow we got to the conclusion that if it's not economics and commerce, then it has to be politics and security. So UNASUR is this very weird organization in which you only talk about politics and security, right? I would suggest, and I think that it was Roberto yesterday, the one who suggested this, I would debate the idea that thing has worked in terms of security too. I think that for me, UNASUR sort of codifies existing behavior among South American states. It hasn't changed anything, but as a good Colombian, I have a very pessimist version of UNASUR. Our Brazilian friends are gone. The reason why I mention this is because there's a lot of insistence on this point that we can achieve some sort of political consensus, even though due to the fact that we cannot achieve a commercial and economic consensus, right? So when you see, for example, Colombia going to the Security Council, the argument is we're gonna defend the Latin American position, right? The Brazilians very often say, and you hear, officers and academics too, saying that they want to be in the Security Council to defend some sort of Latin America. No, they don't say Latin America. They say South American position, right? It's not Latin America. It's South America, which is totally different. So somehow we got to this point. I totally agree with you. I think that that's a lost debate, but the sort of leadership that different countries are sort of generating at this point is based on the fact that that's a goal that you can accomplish. So that's the problem that you get when you start insisting on these regional organizations that are more concerned with politics than with economics. FARC and ELN.
Is there a link between narco trafficking and...
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that's where they get the money from. Yeah, it's debated how. They say that the only thing that they do is to surveil crops. Some other people say that they are totally involved in the business, that they are trafficking and that they have the whole infrastructure to do this. But that's mainly where they are getting their money from. This is the reason why they don't kidnap anymore. No, I agree, and we're all benefiting from that. The thing with Malvinas and Argentina is the Falklands is clear. I mean, with UNASUR got into the point where they just basically supported Argentina's demand for the islands, and this is super important for Argentina. I mean, the last time they didn't even get to do that through the how do you say that in English? The Inter-American Defense Treatment or Treaty, or however you call it. And even Colombia has benefited from that. I mean, we got support from all the region in the fight against the insurgency too. So I agree with you, it's important. I'm just saying that It's hard. It's very hard. But the one and only thing that I want to add to that is that this UNASUR concept and the CELAC concept have one problem in my view, though, which is basically that they are trying, and not in the view of all countries, especially in the view of Venezuela and some other countries of that sort of ideological lean. They have the problem that they want to have these political conversations without the United States in every single instance. And if you hear Chavez has this idea that the OAS is a sort of useless organization that we just have to get rid of because it's useless. We don't need that stuff anymore. And I think that that's a very, very I don't think that it's a good approach, and this is one of the positions that the Colombian government has tried to put forward. We still need to talk to the U.S. This idea that the Organization of American States was the place where Latin America was kneeling in front of the U.S. and it was a scenario of domination is not that true. You know, that was the scenario where Latin America, in many different instances, got a consensual position and said no to the U.S. So it's a scenario for conversation. I just don't find, excluding these different multilateral approaches.